comments related to the OWP. At this point, I think I'll be turning it over to staff to go over that. And then Farhad, whoever is going to be presenting, I know we had a little review of this during April, but just as a review, could you, when you're going over this, distinguish between sort of the RTA funding? It came up at our last regional council meeting as well, and the differential between the OWP and how that relates and works with the RTA.
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chair, members of the executive committee. Jamie Brown's going to give you a presentation, and as you mentioned, this item was discussed at the retreat as well, and so it'll be some of the same information, but then since then we had additional meetings with some of our partners and with the management committee, and we received similar questions along the lines of what you just mentioned, what's the difference between the funding sources and what funds are eligible for what purposes. So there is a document attached to the packet with all the comments, questions, as well as the responses to all those. And Jamie will attempt to answer some of those, especially the ones that are new versus what we had in the previous OWP. But just more specifically on the RTA side, as you all know, RTA is a separate governing body. It's a separate funding source. PAG is responsible as a fiscal agent to manage RTA funds, but all the RTA funds are dedicated to RTA voter approved plan. So as much as we like to think the local funds are flexible, they are tied to the plan, and it has to be in compliance with the RTA approved plan. So they are flexible in one respect, but at the same time, there's very little opportunity to use those funds for anything other than what's in the plan itself.
Farhad, I remember at the retreat, and maybe Jamie can cover this, because isn't this where we were talking about sort of different pots of money? And I think Jamie informed us on certain ones have different flexibility and certain ones, if I'm remembering correctly from the retreat.
That's correct. So as part of the TIP, which is the budget side of the equation, the TIP identifies what flavor of the funds are used for what purposes. And the regional council approved the TIP last Thursday. So the revenue side of the program is already approved by the regional council, but different flavors of funds are used for different purposes, and what they're eligible for typically is outlined through either federal or state guidelines. And that's why the OWP is a product of partnership with ADOT, FHWA, and FTA. They are ultimately the ones that determine what those funds can be used for, what they're eligible to be used for. The OWP itself is a planning document for us to determine how we want to allocate our resources and those funds, and they have to be in compliance with the funding sources and what they're eligible to be used for. And then that's why ADOT provides the oversight for the overall plan.
Right.
So with that, if you don't mind, we'll have Jamie go over the overview and then hopefully open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Mohini. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Executive Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to provide a brief presentation on this item. And so next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just by way of an overview, the overall work program is a statement of work or scope of work known internally as the OWP, or overall work program, and is required as the basis of a contract with ADOT. It's built on the previously adopted OWP, which was adopted in 2019. And as you can see from that graphic on the right, all of the overall work programs really build on each other over the years. This item, as was just previously mentioned, was presented to the Regional Council on April 22nd. And then the OWP budget items that are included in the tip were approved last week on May 27th. Next slide, please. In terms of the organization of the document, it's important to recognize that it must be developed consistent with federal regulations for federally designated metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, like PAG. So the background and overview section of the draft OWP discusses PAG's various roles and responsibilities. It also covers our MPO as well as our transportation management area designations. And finally, it covers federal planning factors and emphasis areas. Next slide. Thank you. The OWP includes various chapters, and you can see the covers of those chapters that cover 18 different work elements. So we have transportation activities, integrated planning and smart region, other programs and services, RTA support, pass-through partnerships, and administration. The appendices include a structural organization chart for PAG. It includes a table that shows the connection between the planning factors and emphasis areas with PAG's 18 different work elements. It also includes an appendix that covers highlights and accomplishments. And finally, it includes the budget tables, which I'll discuss briefly later. Next slide, please. For each of the different sections of the OWP and each of the different 18 work elements, there's a discussion of the purpose. And you can see on the far right, you see the screen capture of transportation activities includes the purpose, the various funding sources. As Farhad had mentioned, different funding sources have different requirements and restrictions. And so this, for each of these work elements, it lists the eligible funding sources. We also have tables of projected outcomes with estimated completion dates, and finally, different goals and strategies to accomplish those. Next slide, please. In terms of the proposed OWP, again, it's important to recognize that it's built on the currently adopted OWP. And so of the 128 projected outcomes from those tables that I mentioned, 80% are substantively similar as a continuation of the adopted OWP. 7% are added as new outcomes, and 13% are completed or listed as removed from the proposed OWP as compared with the current OWP. So it's important, again, to emphasize that we're required to fulfill federal requirements and contracts and obligations. And so there's not a whole lot of change between the two OWPs. Also, I should mention that in April, we conducted a review with our state and federal funding partners with ADOT, FHWA, and FTA. They provided feedback, which we incorporated. And also the management committee some of the members of the management committee provided written comments and questions about the draft OWP. So those are all included in the packet, as well as PAG's responses. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of committee activity over the last 2 years and the elements of the OWP, different elements have been discussed in various working groups or committees over the OWP implementation period. So for example, based on a tally of all the agendas from committees, 102 distinct items related to the current draft OWP were on the agendas and discussed over the last 2 years. So all proposed new additions or removed items are informed by these collective discussions and efforts as the proposed OWP was developed. Now, in terms of the budget tables, there are 6 for each fiscal year. And again, the OWP covers 2 fiscal years. So I'll just show fiscal year 22 for illustrative purposes. And we covered this again at the April special meeting. But table 1 shows the anticipated revenue or funds available. And it's listed by, as you move from top to bottom, looking at the table from federal at the top, to state in the middle, and local at the bottom. And the total really represents the maximum capacity that PAG has to spend, but we must be frugal so that we don't spend over the allocated amount. In general, funds that aren't spent can carry over to the next fiscal year. And if we spend over that amount, then we need to go through an OWP amendment process. So again, we must be frugal with our spending. Table 2 shows local share contributions, which are critical for PAG to meet its match requirements for the federal funds we receive. Table 3 is a more detailed breakdown of Table 1 that shows the total revenue by program area. So again, federal, state, and local funds, but shown by the 18 different work elements.
And Jamie, on that last slide, I think it came up at the retreat, the one before that. Those figures haven't, because aren't they based sort of on population, but haven't been adjusted for a long period of time, which actually is beneficial to us individually?
Mr. Chair, if I may, so those figures were somewhat negotiated and agreed to a long time ago, I believe roughly over 14, 15 years ago. And they haven't changed since then. If you look at between City of Tucson and Pima County, initially they agreed to pay for a bulk of that. So they're paying roughly $300 each. And then the remaining members, based on discussions and negotiations at the time, came up with those numbers based on the balance that was needed for the match requirement. So for the remaining members, yes, that was based on population, but for city and county, that was just the agreed upon number that they agreed to pay equal amounts for a bulk of those funds.
Thanks.
And Table 4 shows total expenditures by program area and category, again broken down by the 18 different work elements, showing personnel expenses, employee-related expenses, office, etc. Table 5 shows staff allocation by the program areas of transportation activities, integrated planning and smart region, etc., showing a budget capacity in fiscal year 22 of 55.5 full-time equivalent. And Table 6 is, this is the final table, is the capital equipment and consultants, including pass-through funding, with an estimated cost of $5,000 or greater. Again, broken down by work element and program. So there are two for fiscal year 22. There are actually 2 pages of this table. It's important to recognize that the OWP is the basis for an agreement between PAG and ADOT. And that agreement is very detailed in terms of PAG's requirements for billing, procurement, various deadlines, etc. And it's also important to recognize that ADOT has primary responsibility for administering FHWA and FTA funds allocated to the MPO and ensuring that such funds are expended for eligible cost purposes and activities. And again, this is why we conduct that review with our federal and state funding partners to make sure we're in compliance. In terms of priorities for the next 2 fiscal years, RTA and RTA Next plan development are at the very top. As all of you are aware that the current RTA plan will sunset in 2026. So it's critical that all of our activities are ensuring that we meet the commitments within the current RTA plan. So that includes our next long-range transportation plan and our next TIP. Although the RMAP, the Regional Mobility and Accessibility Plan, that's the PAG's long-range regional transportation plan. The update for that was approved by Regional Council last September. And it's also mentioned that it must be consistent with the RTA plan, but it's a multi-year process to develop a long-range regional transportation plan. So there'll be a lot of emphasis on that over the next 2 years. So that's another priority. Fulfilling any obligations to contracts and or due to contracts under federal and state mandates is another ongoing priority, as well as data and technical tools to support these efforts.
May, Mr. Chair. So this kind of goes back to your question about how the OWP is related to the RTA. And as Jamie just mentioned, we do prioritize the current RTA and development of the next RTA as part of our OWP discussion. And that's where you get some kind of probably confusion from folks that how PAG and RTA are related. So by agreement between PAG and RTA, basically we have that authority to implement development of the new RTA plan. And I believe there was an MOU attached to the packet that was approved by the Regional Council and RTA Board that explains a little bit more that role and responsibility of PAG and how RTA-related issues bleed over to PAG-related issues. And as you know, we're discussing a lot of other topics related to the RTA next, and that's somewhat tied into the OWP process.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chair and members of the Executive Committee, we're happy to take questions and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie, I just had one quick question, then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to see if they have questions. So it's a 2-year plan, but it does get revisited, if I'm not correct, each year on a rolling 2-year plan. Is that correct or incorrect?
So our goal, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, our goal is to amend no more than one time as needed. Obviously, you have the flexibility to amend as many times as you like. Previously, we used to do these annually, and this is the second time that ADOT has requested to do a 2-year plan. We believe most likely we're going to need at least one amendment. It's one of those exercises that even ADOT folks understand that it's difficult to plan out for 2 years, even though it's a living and a dynamic document. We all anticipate at least one amendment, if not more.
Correct. And this is for them to also help have their planning purposes and work plan set out under this contractual agreement with us as PAG, correct?
That is correct. So a lot of the outcomes and products that come out of the MPO, similar to the RMAP, the TIP document, all that information rolls up into the state documents as well. So we need to coordinate closely with ADOT to make sure, especially the TIP document, because that rolls into ADOT's TIP as well.
Right. And if this isn't approved, basically we're at a standstill under that contract with ADOT. Am I surmising that correctly?
So by definition, the current work plan, the 80% plus that Jamie mentioned, that's still an ongoing activity. We continue those activities. It's only the new 7% additional activities that we won't be authorized to initiate unless it's included in the new agreement.
I gotcha. Okay. That's all I had for now. Do my colleagues have any questions for staff?
I have, well, actually, Farhad, that was the question I had as far as approval. So that clarified that. But maybe I'll follow up. What is the timeline for the approval of the OWP that would include those new outcomes?
So typically, the process for ADOT is to have it approved before the beginning of the fiscal year, which would be July 1. As I mentioned earlier, the TIP document that was approved, so the revenue will be there July 1 for fiscal year 22. But if the OWP is not approved for those new activities, we just can't access those funds for those new activities until we have our OWP approved. And it's okay if it's after July 1. I don't think there is any rush. But obviously from our perspective, we like to have an understanding of if there is support for those new activities so we can start the process and access those funds that are already approved in the TIP.
And this is a 2-year document. Of the 80% that are this rollover, is there funding to implement those projects, and if not, there is funding?
Yes, so those funds are all approved either through the TIP document or through direct allocation from ADOT. Those are allocations that come to the MPO for planning purposes. So all those activities that are in current document are already approved. The revenue side is already approved. It's only that 7% new activities that we can't access those until we approve that. And to give you an example, some of them are actually mostly transit-related activities. We have several transit studies. We have operational analysis for transit. We have some additional surveys for transit. Those are new activities that we won't be able to access those until the new OWP is approved.
So the 80% that have been approved, what is the amount of funding needed for those to implement those programs?
I would say it's roughly, out of the $13 million, I would say the transit portion of it is roughly about 2 million. So about 10 million of that is already approved. So it's the balance, about $3 million that we won't be able to access roughly for those new initiatives.
So that 7% represents another 3 million for a
Yes.
total of 13.
Yeah, mostly because of the transit funds. We had a good chunk of transit dollars that we're able to access, and we want to conduct surveys and comprehensive analysis. And so that is a good chunk of the funds that are coming through. Jeff, we lost. There we go. Those are the good chunk of money that are coming through FTA. So that's definitely a good opportunity for us to be able to access those FDA funds.
And so those new outcomes, that represents a 7% add-on, but about 30% of additional funding. Is that, am I doing my quick?
Roughly because it was mostly FDA funds that we had banked to be able to utilize for a larger initiative. So with FDA funds, we're able to bank those for several years. And in partnership with Suntran, we were able to identify some opportunities to spend those dollars. And that's in the proposed plan to spend those dollars in FY 22 and 23.
And then that 13% completion or removal, does that represent, what's the timeline? Is that a 12, is that this past fiscal year, or does that?
Those were over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, we had several activities that were one-time activities that were removed or rephrased. So the outcomes we're looking for, typically if they're completed, obviously it moves off of the new OWP. If it's something that needs to continue on because it's a requirement to continue on, that's in the 80% category.
And the 13% of, so that seems like a relatively low if this is a 2-year plan and these different programs are fully funded. Why the relatively low completion percentage?
Because it's the 80% are things that are ongoing, we continuously have to work on. So for example, the tip doc.
Well, there's never an end date, so to speak.
Exactly. So the tip document, we just finished the tip last Thursday, and then we start developing the new tip for 2 years from now. So that's included in the old document as one tip, and then in the new document as a new tip. So that's an ongoing effort. It's not completed by that definition.
I see.
Same thing with the RMAP. The RMAP is the long range planning effort. That's continuously ongoing. The data collection, modeling, that's an ongoing effort that it's always in that 80% category. And you only complete the product, but then you start a new product.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Chair.
Thank you. And you made me think of a couple of others. Do we have the ability to lose some of that funding? That if we don't act on that 7%, because it seems like though it's 7, it's a pretty good chunk of money. So one, do we have the capability of losing it? Or two, if we don't, does it certainly delay those efforts that have been identified to keep going?
Yeah. Our partners at FTA, FHWA, ADOT, they're wonderful to work with, very supportive. They've always indicated that they're willing to extend and be flexible to accommodate our needs. So obviously I wouldn't say we lose the money. I would just say we lose the time and the opportunity to initiate those efforts. Those are important efforts in our opinion, especially the transit element, especially due to COVID and post-pandemic. We really need to get an understanding on how the pandemic affected the transit ridership and start looking at some opportunities to improve transit services. And that's one of the reasons we included that as one of the new initiatives, to go out and do a survey and then do an operational analysis so we can make sure that we continue to provide good transit services.
Right. Super. Chair, do you have any questions? Or Chairman, Peter?
Oh, yeah, I think the questions you guys are good. I know that Farhad and everybody and Jamie and everybody here works very hard to make sure that we don't lose those opportunities. And I think the highlight of this meeting would be to do that, to make sure that we have an understanding that even though, like he said, we don't lose anything, but we must do things on a timely basis to make sure that we absolutely capitalize on, especially transit. It did affect a lot of things with the pandemic and everybody's fear and all that. And how do we restore the faith back in the community to be able to get on the transit system and make sure that they're safe? So that's part of the campaign that we should have.
I would agree with you, Chairman. I've always been taught time is money. Certainly in this case, and to your point, to try to understand as quickly as possible, especially as it relates to transit, where does the confidence come back? What are the things that have to be surveyed and learned on how to gain that confidence back? And I think if we lose any time, proceeding on that, I think that would be, bad on us from that perspective. I would concur. Staff, and what would be a good outcome of this meeting that you're looking for? Would it be a motion on our part to approve this OWP for 2022 and 2023 so we can keep moving?
So, Mr. Chair, obviously we want to have this opportunity to give you an update and obviously have an opportunity to acknowledge the comments we received from the management committee and the responses that were provided. We were able to make some adjustments as a result of those questions. Great questions, valid, and we hope that our responses were clear enough to answer those questions. I like to follow up one-on-one with individuals that submitted questions and make sure that we confirm that we had answered their questions. So we plan to do that. And with your support, we like to make sure that there is consensus, at least among the officers, that we want to move forward and convey to ADOT folks that we will come back and have the regional council act on this at a later time. But in the interest of time, we want to have your endorsement so ADOT can start the process on their end as well.
Well, I personally, reviewed the comments as well as the answers, and I thought they were very thorough. It's good to hear that you'll do a personal follow-up as well to help clarify anything. So I'm certainly satisfied with the work that's been accomplished, and think it's important that we keep it moving as rapidly as possible, as the chairman said, for getting a better understanding of the needs of the transit community and get them back on as quickly as possible.
I had a couple of follow-up questions, Chair Murphy.
Yes.
I'm curious, it's more of a curiosity, but at the national level, with the discussion about an infrastructure legislation, it seems to be, in the $1 trillion to $2 trillion range. Does that, if that were to pass, what effect does that have for the OWP, if any, and for the TIP that we just approved last week?
Yeah, excellent question. We are monitoring those discussions closely, working with our partners at state and federal level. We're hopeful and optimistic that there is going to be a bill that's going to provide additional funding to our region. And going back to our initial discussions, anytime any new funding comes to the region, we're able to bring that back to our discussion and be able to amend, whether it's amending the TIP or amending the OWP, to be able to utilize any new funds that come to the region. We are just as optimistic as everybody else that hopefully there will be a transportation bill that's going to be reauthorized and additional funding are going to be coming our way. So that'll be a standalone effort to identify priorities for those dollars, and then we would amend the TIP through the regional council and then amend the OWP as needed as well.
One other question. In that 7% new outcomes category, are there any FTA requirements that might affect the eligibility for any of the 80% that are ongoing?
So as I mentioned earlier, a good chunk of that are FDA dollars, and we've already worked with our partners to be able to provide the match. The match requirement for FTA dollars are 20%. So we're going to partner with City of Tucson and Suntran to provide the match to be able to utilize the FTA funds. FTA funds are a little bit more restrictive, obviously. So as part of our review with FDA, they had already indicated that what we're proposing to do is consistent with FDA dollar eligibilities.
Thank you.
And to follow up on the mayor's question, if we did get additional new dollars, from the federal government, would staff's first, foundational look at it be back to our RTA projects now that we're in the last 5 years? Would initially the look at being what we could do to continue keeping our projects moving forward and to complete as many of those in those last 5 years? Or will some of those pots of money be restricted potentially and be for other things that are not part of the original 20-year plan?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, if you recall, we had that conversation at the retreat as well. So federal dollars, especially for projects, are somewhat restrictive. So that's a decision that needs to be made by the board at the time. If you have projects that are not federalized, would you want to federalize those projects and have those additional restrictions, which typically cost more money and time? So that'll be a conversation to have at that time. Hopefully it's a good problem to have. More money would be a good problem. But I would be cautious about federalizing projects that may be delayed or additional costs would be introduced if we federalize those projects. So we would have to be very selective, I would say.
Yeah, so it's always about sometimes the strings that are attached to it. If we get these new dollars, and how can we best utilize them in a timely fashion? Would that be correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues?
I don't have any, Chair Murphy.
Neither do I, but I agree with you. I'm satisfied with, we have and hopefully we'll move forward to bring it to the regional.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to add that, with your endorsement, we would like to proceed and continue our conversation with ADOT partners on this contract. It is a contract. So ultimately, we would bring the contract back to Regional Council for final approval when it's ready, but we would really appreciate your endorsement. And again, I want to thank Management Committee and other committee members, like Jamie mentioned earlier. We've taken majority of these items through various other committees, and they're all very supportive and I believe instrumental in development of our plan. So I want to thank all of them, and I will follow up with those individuals that submitted comments. So we want to make sure that with your endorsement, that they understand the path forward would be to continue our conversations with ADOT.
And do you think it would be helpful? Would you like a formal motion on our behalf endorsing what's been done to this point to bring it back?
That would be helpful, especially our ADOT partners would like to know that since there was a delay in our process, that our process is consistent with your wishes.
Thank you. And at this time, since the chairman took the extra effort to actually come in there personally, I don't know if he'd like to make this motion or
Make the motion.
Entertain a second. Mayor Winfield, would you like to be a second?
Yep.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Having no more further business for the public, we're adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Good day.